Welcome. Thanks everyone for joining me. I'm super thrilled to be here today with Omar Zahzah talking about their new book, Terms of Servitude. Well, it's not as new anymore, but still hot off the presses in many ways. And today's conversation will follow up on many of those. One of the things that I really love about this book, there are many, but they are one of them is the way you talk, you enter in, the way you talk about setting a scene, and scene is not quite the right word, but thinking about how to write in moments, the moments that we're living through. And so I just wanted to ground us in that in a way. Um, Sometimes I like to offer some framing remarks about what's happening in the moment, and I don't really have anything specific to say beyond the fact that we are living through a tremendous moment of Zionist expansionism. Your book beautifully talks about that in relation to the digital realm, but of course, we're also living through and witnessing in terms of what is happening in the south of Lebanon. Of course, the unprovoked aggression on Iran, joint led by the US and Israel. Um, and um, and of course the genocide that we have been witnessing now for years. Um, so I really appreciate that you speak to that as a way of entering into the book itself. And I just wanted to offer a couple of words also by way of introduction. Omar Zahzah, this is the formal introduction and bio that I received, is an assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas, or Ahmed Studies, in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. They're also the author of Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. And that's what we'll be hearing about today. And that was all I received. But it is quite limited bio, if you know anything about Omar. If you look Omar up on the internet, which in many ways the internet is IRL, as they convincingly argue in the book, you'll find out that Omar is also more broadly a writer, a poet, and an organizer, an artist, musician, freelance journalist. Of course, this book is based on a lot of that freelance journalism. All of this says that they're creative in the fiercest ways, imagining and creating toward libertarian futures. That's just one of the reasons why I'm thrilled to be here today and excited for our conversation. And thank you for coming. So with that, I'll just open it up to you. Folks, if you, as you're listening, have questions that occur to you, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then I'll be facilitating and moderating that afterward. And we'll also be working to drop any links of things that you mention as you're speaking.
Well, thank you so much, Amira, and thank you to the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, more broadly, for hosting me to talk about this book today. I think it's a great privilege to be here, because I'm a big admirer of the work that the Institute does, and I think it's a really important resource and hub, I think, for the movement because you know, there's no shortage of different formations, for Palestine. But I think something that really foregrounds the need for the intellectual understanding and assessment of Zionism is very crucial. So, thank you for all of the work that you all are doing as well. So, typically in these conversations, what I've tended to do is to, spend some time kind of talking about the genesis of the project and how it came to be. And through that narrative, basically come to some of the conceptual interventions that I try to make in the book, kind of setting up what it is that the project, intends to accomplish. Um, and so with that, I think I'll kind of start just by remarking that, part of what I was interested in doing from the outset was really providing the movement at large with some language, with some frameworks that could hopefully be actionable. And what I mean by that is I wanted to think of a term or ultimately even a paradigm that could sort of encapsulate what I felt to be particular types of repression that were becoming increasingly normalized within the digital sphere. And, I was primarily, at least from the start of the project, really focusing in particular on the ways that Palestinians or people who are in support of Palestine tended to have a particular forms of repression or censorship on hegemonic digital spaces kind of increasingly normalized. Um, and so, you know, by way of kind of getting a little bit more concrete, I'll sort of set up to talk about what some of the main flashpoints for my own kind of coming into consciousness of this dynamic were. So, and I think with that, it's helpful to also kind of flag that this book is really in many ways the outgrowth of two particular moments, of consequence for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Um, and so with that, I think it's important to note that, I'm actually beginning well before October 7th, 2023. For me, actually, the project begins in late 2021. Um, and for, I think most people will recall, but just in case folks don't, this was around the time where we start seeing increasing activism and organizing emanating from Sheikh Jarrah, which is the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood. And at that point in time, Palestinians were facing expulsion essentially by the Israeli state. The media often framed this as, potential eviction orders, but that's problematic because, eviction implies that there's some kind of legitimate, some kind of a landlord type situation, when in reality, this is, colonized, militarily occupied land, which is, illegitimate. But so they were essentially these Palestinians were going to be expelled from their homes. And, in opposition to this, they start to mount, different forms of organizing and demonstrations and activism. And part of what they rely on, out of a slew of tools is the internet, and social media. And, I think in large part as a consequence, perhaps of this moment having followed very closely on the heels of the 2020 George Floyd and Breonna Taylor uprisings, right? Where you had another instance where there was this kind of convergence of the savvy kind of use of digital media to call attention to issues of, systemic oppression in such a way that really shifted cultural conversations around issues of, discrimination, oppression, kind of, um, let's say, flattening or displacing the usual model with which kind of liberal renditions of racism tend to present us, right? This idea that it's just about individual prejudice, it's just about individual bigotry, as opposed to a systemic issue. I think with 2020, we started to see kind of a shift in terms of cultural framings of these dynamics so that an understanding of anti-Black racism not stemming just from individual attitudes, but actually being a systemic issue to the point where we needed to have broader cultural reckonings with, legacies of white supremacy, of, chattel slavery, of, Jim Crow, all of these things and how they continue to exert real life influences upon society as such. That broader shift, I think, was very instrumental, for kind of priming a cultural priming, let's say, for other reckonings with contexts of broader sort of structural oppression. And so I think it's important that you have 2021 happening when it does, and that you have this kind of broader, what felt to be a cultural receptivity to these kind of reconsiderations of issues that otherwise had tended to be more or less treated as settled within the broader kind of, legacy media liberal consensus, let's call it. So when you start to have, this organizing, this activism, and you have these posts from, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah going increasingly viral, you start to see, you know, posts and writings from Hamad al-Kurd. You have clips, including the clip from Wana al-Kurd, which the kind of that clip of Yaqub the settler, who is one of the settlers, is basically occupying their house, where he says, well, if I don't steal your house, somebody else is going to steal it. Things like that just continue to spread. You start to have, Palestinians being increasingly platformed on outlets within legacy media, which primarily had been actually one of the ultimate spaces of Palestinian erasure historically, right? All the way back in 1984, Edward Said would talk about Palestinians being denied permission to narrate, primarily by way of this very sophisticated and savvy legacy media apparatus within the West, primarily the US, but also within English channels, I believe, where it was just pretty much common, the norm, let's say, that Palestinians are not platformed, whereas Palestine, as a topic continues to be talked about. But the perspectives that tend to be platformed, that tend to be featured, are Israeli or supporters of Israel, right? And so there's always been this systemic media-based erasure of Palestinian voices, Palestinian perspectives, even as the question of Palestine is something that is talked about often without them being present. So, what was happening in this moment, going from 2021 even into 2022, where you have, the uprising known as the Unity Intifada, where you start to see messaging, Palestinians kind of rekindling what I think had been a really important form of revolutionary common sense since the launch of the modern Palestinian liberation movement in the 1960s. This idea that Palestinians, wherever they are, we're all one interconnected people engaged in this revolutionary struggle, for the liberation of land and people. So whether you're in Palestine, whether you're, in exile or in the diaspora, as it's sometimes also referred to, or wherever you are, essentially, you have a stake and even a duty to continue to fight for a liberated Palestine, right? So by 2022, you kind of start to see this sentiment sort of being re-expressed, re-articulated in ways that, again, are, kind of gaining prominence in terms of their dissemination. And so, this was important for several reasons. One of them was that we were very clearly seeing in real time this savvy usage of digital media by Palestinians to kind of take a crowbar, let's say, to, their exclusion from, traditional legacy media spaces. And they were so effective at it that essentially those spaces started to have to relent a little bit and to kind of permit them entry and let them on. And secondly, when they gained entry into those spaces, their messaging was not watered down. It was often, again, a very intentional intervention, reframing the ways that the media tends to talk about Palestine, from things like the centuries old struggle, these various forms of liberal Zionist propaganda that really present it as a question of, like religious extremism, or two equally endowed actors, who are simply driven by hatred for one another. All of these ridiculous, tropes that we in the movement know, have no, value ultimately, but that tend to be repackaged, whenever the topic is talked about, if it is talked about at all. So when they are platform based, they're very intentional about, really undoing these framings, about insisting on the actual structural character of the Palestinian struggle, which is a struggle against settler colonialism, right? That continues. Um, and so, you have this moment where it seems like we're seeing increasing presence of Palestinian voices and perspectives. We're having broader kind of reconsiderations at the, um, kind of the centers of media culture that are rethinking the way that Palestine is discussed and framed. And, to me, it felt very palpable. And yet, just as you start to have these shifts, and these interventions that are clearly taking effect, then, the very spaces that had, somewhat enabled this to happen, however inadvertently, and by this I mean the digital media spaces, the hegemonic sites, like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at the time, they start to increasingly engage in censorship of Palestine or posts about, Sheikh Jarrah, then most recent bombing campaigns of the Gaza Strip, of the Israeli occupation forces incursions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And, it happens at such a scale that it's very obvious that this is, collective repression or collective censorship. And, I think it's always kind of funny to talk about this because I almost feel like by now, the kind of anti-Palestinian um, content moderation practices of these companies is so taken for granted that it doesn't really feel remarkable when I say it. But at the time, this was the first moment where people were really reckoning with the fact that these companies are engaging in mass censorship of posts about Palestine and against Palestinian users. And so they are sort of required to come up with some kind of an explanation, however unsatisfactory it is. And so, you start to have, again, legacy media outlets. And by the way, when I say legacy media, just in case, anybody is curious about that term, I'm just referring to essentially different forms of more traditional media that are not social media. So, like news broadcasts, newspapers, magazines, um, things of that nature. So legacy media starts to report on this. Why is there so much mass censorship? And of course, these companies come up with this unsatisfactory explanation and say, well, we've been experiencing a glitch, right? We don't engage in mass censorship. We value all individual voices, and we champion democracy. All of these things. This is just a technical issue, and we're working to resolve it. Very similar to what they say whenever they're called to account for different types of controversies related to content moderation in general. Um, and so, what I think I'll note about that too is that perhaps it was a bit of naivete, but seeing Sheikh Jarrah, the Unity Intifada, I mean, these were clearly moments of repression, right? And yet, I think the ways in which Palestinians were making such strategic interventions and the way that they felt to be palpable, to the point where they were really successful in reframing kind of a broader cultural conversation. It just sort of felt to me that the censorship was sort of bound to fail because there seemed to be some kind of a shift that was just around the corner, right? Um, so, I'm recognizing it now. Perhaps it was a bit of, an overly idealistic response to it, but, I was very impressed by all of these shifts that were taking place. So even when you start to have this intensive repression, it seemed like it was going to only be for a limited time because it just seems that it was so patently in response to an effective ability, to kind of intervene in the conversation, to introduce, new ways of understanding what had often been a very, you know, censored topic. But, obviously we know that that's not the case. And I haven't yet come to October 7th, which I will come to. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about very quickly, the second kind of major incident that was sort of important to my thinking through these issues. And that's that, as again, some, I think people here, particularly in the Institute, will recall, in, I believe, November 2020, you have this open classroom that's posted by Rabab Abdul Hadi, Palestinian feminist scholar, founder of the Ahmed Studies program, that I teach in, along with Tomomi Kinokawa, Women and Gender Studies. They co-host this open classroom that features Leila Khaled in conversation with other icons of, liberation struggles the world over. And as a result of a Zionist pressure campaign that is actually um, instigated in large part by this now defunct app called ActIL, which some of you may be familiar with, but basically it was this Israeli aligned app that encourages its users to go on various quests, and which it kind of um, aestheticizes as being games. So, but they're usually quests that are set up around, getting particular speakers canceled, or, like getting classes, getting events shut down, basically complaining about anything, that doesn't toe the line regarding, the uh, inability to question Zionism as the ultimate status quo, for thinking about issues related to Palestine, right? And so this app sends people on a quest essentially to complain to Zoom, or to engage in protests against, at Zoom's headquarters, which happens. to the point where Zoom actually capitulates and says, okay, we're not going to host this event, which is the first time that a classroom and in the midst of the pandemic, when everybody is dependent on this video conferencing platform, happens, right? So, you have this major video conferencing platform that everybody is essentially dependent upon, because we're under lockdown at the time. You have this massive social media censorship that is being sort of increasingly streamlined, about Palestinians posting about Sheikh Jarrah, about, bombing in Gaza. I'm seeing all of these things play out, and, it just seems to me that it's so clear that there is such an increasingly normalized concept moderation approach, which is to erase Palestinians, from all of these mainstream platforms on various levels. And so in 2021, I write an article for Al Jazeera where I describe these things, and I use the term digital apartheid, to discuss this phenomenon, because at the time I'm thinking of the sense of being physically, separated or shut off, from the digital sphere. So I think of it as a digital extension of the physical apartheid, that the Zionist state imposes upon Palestinians. And then, but, again, as I'd been referring earlier to kind of my sense of idealism, there was this feeling for me, like, again, like these things are becoming increasingly entrenched, and yet it's very clear that, the Palestinian narrative as such, there is much less control over it than there had been, even just a few years prior, and that people are sort of starting to come into a different consciousness regarding Palestine. So again, even though it seemed like the repression was very entrenched, it also felt like it was only a matter of time before it would start to be ineffective. So I didn't necessarily think that much of the project, after that. I didn't even think about it as a project. I thought of it as an article, and then I thought that, that was it. But then over time, I start to be commissioned to write more pieces for outlets like Electronic Intifada or like Mondoweiss, related to the different forms of digital repression that people are facing, from this ongoing censorship of posts related to Palestine to doxing and harassment by sites like, Canary Mission or the newer StopAntisemitism.org. And, it becomes clear that, different types of digital repression of people engaged in the Palestinian struggle is an important topic. And it was actually somewhat let's say underanalyzed, and I want to be careful here because I know we have, really important organizations like Hamla that is literally dedicated to, Palestinian digital rights and really, basically tracking all of the receipts about different forms of repression that Palestinians face. So I don't mean to say that nobody does this work, but what I mean is that to the degree to which Palestinians are repressed, it seemed like there needed to be a lot more kind of cultural reckoning with it. And that sort of scale didn't seem to be in place, right? And I started thinking to the fact that, we were having more works around the different ways that big tech fortifies particular forms of systemic oppression, like Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, or Safia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, right? Or yeah, just different works basically that are really geared toward analyzing the issue of how, for all of its branding, big tech was actually re-entrenching, systems of oppression and discrimination, and even dispossession. Yet, although, the repression of Palestinians, within the kind of digital sphere was so entrenched and so patent, it seemed like there was kind of a dearth of cultural commentary upon it, certainly much less than it actually warranted, and coming from many different spheres, right? And so it occurred to me then that, probably a longer study about this issue that really focused on the particular ways that, the digital realm acts as an extension of physical processes of apartheid, military occupation, colonization, and dispossession could be, an important intervention and a contribution to this growing trend of what we might think of as tech critical scholarship more broadly. And so, I basically spent some time thinking about a framing for the book. I reached out to, dear colleagues like Nora Barros-Friedman from Electronic Intifada and kind of had this conversation. I'm thinking about this study, what is your sense of, its relevance to the movement more broadly? And, then I pitch the book. The manuscript is accepted by the Censored Press in partnership with Seven Stories Press. And this is now when we'll get to, October 7th. All of this kind of happens right before, this most recent escalated genocide has begun. And so, I'm already started to work on the project. We're about a year in, then you have, the latest genocide that begins. And so there's kind of a period where I find myself unable to continue working on it, partly because, um, especially at the outset, there's this feeling that the most important thing to really turn one's attention to is different types of mutual aid or actions and not really focusing on things that are about one individual. And so it felt like, you know, thinking about my own intervention or perspective as a writer was not the most important thing at that time. But then, as the genocide continues and it becomes clear there's not really going to be a, again, the type of international intervention or action that something like this you would think would warrant, right? Um, I think, and I don't know if this is collective, but for me personally, it kind of created this new sense of, okay, well, now we really need to be doing whatever we can wherever we are. There may have been this moment of thinking, well, is somebody are we going to have kind of a broad-based sort of like international intervention? Is something going to happen to stop this? Something that is going to reflect the type of just total flouting of any type of international or collective rights that the genocide itself clearly constitutes? Are we going to have something that's um, appropriate to that in terms of a counter response? And that was not the case. So then you think, okay, well, we're going to do whatever we can with wherever we are. And so that kind of um, inspired me to revisit and think about, okay, let's actually see this through to completion. And that's in large part also because, all of the things that I had talked about or, seem to have just been normalized and streamlined. So you have going from 2021, you know, and now you're in this moment of escalated genocide, and this type of censorship of repression is just increasingly normalized. And the stakes in many ways become even more intense because now these types of postings are intended to act as archives of genocide, right? For when we're actually able to have kind of a broader reckoning with it. And yet people are being banned or shadow banned, having their posts deleted, not being able to have any kind of reach, by using the platforms that are the platforms that most people are still on. You have the assassination of, over 200 Palestinian journalists, which is clearly an intentional policy. So, you know, again, we're seeing that, the ability to sort of ban or censor or just expel people from the digital sphere is very interconnected to the outright, policy of assassinating people. All of this is about silencing on many different levels. So that kind of brought me to thinking, okay, well, let's, finish this and talk about, again, what are some of the consequences of these types of actions. The book itself doesn't just talk about social media, but it talks about it a lot. And a large reason for that is that I think that we can kind of underestimate digital media or social media because it's so, in many ways, it's such a part of different aspects of our lives, our social lives, but also our, professional lives at times, or that we can sort of just underestimate it because we've seen, we experience it so much. But actually, the project began with thinking, let's take a step back and ask, how do we come to the point where an entire group of people can essentially be expelled from something that so many of us use or rely on in various ways? And why is it, okay to have that essentially as a policy? And let's think about what some of the implications of that are. And, the main one or that I came to was that this is, in fact, another way in which we're seeing the kind of hegemonic bent of digital media act as an extension of a physical process of colonization, of apartheid, and of course of genocide, right? So um, I had mentioned earlier that when I wrote the piece Digital Apartheid, right, I was thinking of apartheid in terms of separation. And I kind of realized, in working on the manuscript, that apartheid was a little bit insufficient because apartheid is actually one instrument of a broader process of oppression, and that process ultimately is settler colonialism, right? Which includes apartheid, which includes military occupation, um, you know, but is not necessarily reducible just to those things alone. And so in the book, I introduced the concept of digital settler colonialism, or let's say I repurposed it because I'm not the first scholar to use that term, but I use it in a very particular way. And one of which, again, is to talk about how do digital spaces act as a cyber extension of physical processes of colonization, that are inherent to the Zionist project. But secondly, I also really emphasize the fact that what we're seeing is a collusion between big tech as an industry and the Zionist state, right? So this is a very active partnership between these two forces. Um, I know that, I think there tends to be a bit of a back and forth in terms of our discussions about Israel, right? And sometimes, people will discuss how Israel has sort of taken things over. But I think, in fact, that it's important to emphasize that, these companies are very willingly partnering with the Israeli state. They're not deceived because ultimately, you know, fortifying Israeli or Zionist settler colonialism makes a lot of sense when you think of the fact that the media industry as such, and of course, now we're in big tech, so it's a slightly different media industry, but comms in general, media, often hews directly with US imperialism more broadly. And so if that's the case, of course, they're going to also support, this vicious genocidal settler colonial entity in the same way that they support all other projects of US imperialism, right? If they take US imperialism for granted, of course, they're going to take the integrity of Zionist settler colonialism for granted because, support for Israel is one of the main pillars of US imperialism. So, that was the second aspect that I really wanted to emphasize with the concept of digital settler colonialism was that what we're looking at is an active collusion between these two entities, American big tech and, Zionist settler colonialism on the other hand. And so, but I also wanted to make sure that in the book I don't just emphasize the different forms that repression takes, which is why I made sure to have the entire third chapter, or sorry, third section dedicated to different ways that Palestinians or people in support of Palestine engage in resistance, right? So, in that last part, I talk about different things, from militant anti-colonial resistance to the ways that activists and organizers, engaged in the No Tech for Apartheid, coalition, use different forms of kind of labor resistance from the inside, to really mount important challenges to business as usual companies, like Google and Amazon that are engaged in very active contracts with the Israeli military. And then also, interviewing individual content creators or just activists who take to social media and talking to them about what are the different ways that they have utilized social and digital media to sort of, promote awareness and what do they do in this context of increasing repression. And, of course, I would be remiss not to note that, of course, I also, talked to Palestinians in Gaza, including Asim al-Nabi from, the Gaza municipality, and through talking to Asim al-Nabi as well as Yusuf al-Jamal, they really told me about the very intentional and kind of long-standing ways in which Palestinians in Gaza use different forms of social media, including Twitter, and kind of became increasingly adept over the years at using it in such a strategic way as to kind of break the narrative embargoes, that they had been subjected to under different forms of more traditional media or legacy media, and to be able to essentially spread not just information about different attacks, but also enable people to really engage, with different perspectives from Gaza that otherwise, would be erased, due to the siege, due to the various restrictions that they face, and how, their understandings of the, power of narrative, as a force of resistance, which, they had really had fortified, through the influence of Rifat al-Arir, the late poet, Gaza intellectual, was assassinated, by Israel. Um, basically all of those things work hand in hand, right? We're not just talking about digital media, as a tool in and of itself. It's also this idea of people who understand the um, integrity and the significance of narrative as a tool of resistance. So that's what animates, these very savvy types of usages of media that I was trying to, draw attention to in the book, as well as thinking about the different ways that people are repressed. Because I think even though the accounts of repression can be overwhelming, and I think even the tactics of repression, can be very detailed. If we're only focusing on that, then to a certain extent, you also kind of start to do the enemy's work a little bit and make it seem like there's really no way to resist, and there are no people who resist. People do continue to resist, especially in light of seemingly insurmountable odds. So I wanted to make sure that that was also a component of the text as well. And I look at there's another concept that I think of as virtual Palestine that I talk about in the book, which is simply this idea that all of these different types of censorship are not just intended to censor individual posts or ban individual people, they're also intended to erase the idea of Palestine in and of itself as kind of a symbolic center rooted in very real indigenous histories and different forms of knowledge, and cultural heritage. They're trying to expel that as well, with every instance of banning and deletion. But of course, it doesn't work because Palestine continues to have this broader collective significance that continues to animate different forms of resistance, and speaking back to power. So I think with that, I can go ahead and end kind of the more formal portion of the book, but I'm happy to engage in other discussions about different aspects of it in the Q&A. So thank you for your time. And yeah, I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much for that really super helpful broad overview. Um, and while folks are formulating questions, which you all can put in the chat, and then I will facilitate, um, yeah, let's take a moment to applaud, virtually applaud. Um, I I just wanted to offer a couple of things. One of which is sort of thinking about pulling together, naming some of the major strands that you discuss in your book that you mentioned, but kind of like laying them out next to one another, all if we think of them all under the category of a form of like information warfare and the way that the platforms are interacting. So I'm thinking of like the Zoom example, for instance, thinking of how platforms have a particular kind of power, but then how that there's an interaction there with outside Zionist and Israel advocacy orgs and the way that they mobilize to put pressure on those platforms, and then the kind of interaction also with universities as entities that comes up in the Zoom example, but also with government in various kinds of ways. So this isn't a question yet, and it's kind of too broad, but I'm wondering also if you would add to or push back on or help with this kind of framing, to think about through all of the ways this plays out. So thinking one about this like really powerful example you give in the book about phrase not found, sort of, entering in, doing a search, like, oh, as we do, like, oh, let me find this again, doing a search and then encountering the what came back to you was phrase not found, a very powerful kind of overt silencing. So the kind of censorship that you were discussing earlier, and that plays out as what you name as an indigenous epistemicide, there's that kind of overt censorship happening on the platform. There's also reporting as a takedown strategy, which you talk about really beautifully in several different contexts. And that kind of reporting is often mobilized by these other actors. You mentioned act.il, but there's also now so many we could sort of gesture to, and they seem to be increasing that they have on their platforms, they host like click here to report. And so that it's mobilizing these mass responses. And if I'm not mistaken, they're even, I believe it's the ADL also has a one that is like somehow AI enabled and will generate, forms. So we might even like think of bringing AI and generative AI in particular into the conversation. And if we do that, that will help us also think through scale. You mentioned scale, but this idea of like the scale and the speed with which we've been fed this discourse of inevitability, like, well, this is just, the road that we're on, as if there's no way to intervene or push back or restructure the really alarming, problematic way that platforms have this tremendous amount of power. And then I guess the final thing that I would just wanted to highlight and pull out that you talk about it is reflected in your title, terms of servitude, right? The community guidelines themselves and the ways that the platform sort of fall back on that. I love the way you put it in the book as using moderation as social decorum. So thinking, and I was thinking about that in relation to like the way that universities use the civility discourse, like we just let's all be civil as a kind of covert is probably, it's not even that covert, but form of censorship. So these are me just trying to pull together some of the beautiful threads that came out of your talk and also add from some details that are in the book itself. And then I'll pause to see if you have comments, and I see some questions are coming in, so then I'll prompt those.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, I think what I feel the response sets up is we're dealing with a lot of spaces and contexts that I think are nominally distinct, but actually share a lot of common investments. And I think that's ultimately the long conclusion that I eventually came to is that they're using all of these different terms or frameworks, from, the digital companies to the universities that really normalize, these other but very connected types of repression and censorship, like, this disproportionate disciplining of people who engage in protests for Palestine or faculty who speak about Palestine, whether it's they should totally be able to do this in their classrooms anyway, but whether it's in the classroom or off campus, right? It's there's a common politic that they're all sharing, and they're using these different strategies to kind of circumvent naming that ultimately. So things like community standards or community guidelines, or things like respectability, or things like anti-Semitism, because we're seeing, which is not, I mean, this is not new for anybody who's been in the movement for some time, but of course, their anti-Semitism is weaponized in such a way as to ultimately shut down any and all activism or speech around Palestine. It's never really about discrimination as such against Jewish people for being Jewish. It's about anything that challenges the kind of default Zionist status quo that institutions will have, which is again part and parcel of this broader imperial politic um, that all of these spaces share with one another. So I do think that in doing this project, which in many ways felt like I was trying to name the particulars of a specific industry and the ways that it exceptionalizes Palestine and really normalizes a type of repression that is kind of taken for granted culturally. And I felt like I need to sort of name that as a way of kind of trying to, you know, make more people aware of the fact that this is something that had been sort of sanctioned for so long. I realized that I was actually talking about many different industries at the same time as well, because those of us in academia, as I think you have just done very beautifully, will see how closely the logic hews to, the types of sanction that we or our colleagues will be subjected to, right? It's a very similar logic, these very similar tactics and very similar strategies. Um, and I think, but of course, with that too, it's no accident that increasingly the ways that universities are moving is to kind of force all of these different developments. I don't even really want to call them innovations because innovation oftentimes will imply that there's something for the better, right? But there's just this real top-down consensus in terms of forcing different types of AI essentially down our throats. We're seeing that a lot at my university at San Francisco State. I believe there's degrees in AI now. We're getting all of this messaging that that does really emphasize this idea of the inevitability. Um, and so, and of course, these same companies are linked, to all of these different processes of death and destruction, from the targeting in Gaza, to, these ongoing attacks on Iran, to the kidnapping of Maduro, right? All of these companies are invested in sort of all of these things. And at the same time, we're having their products really forced down our throats as part of this broader process that I really see as kind of a process of de-intellectualization, where the university is being continuously unmade from a site that's supposed to promote, even ostensibly, even on their own terms. We can always recognize that they were problematic, but it's at this point, it seems like we're in a particular moment of undoing culture as such and instead really eliminating any space for criticism or dissent, and instead just of complete capitulation to the status quo, from the programmatic level in terms of pedagogy all the way to the different types of technologies that we're supposed to just completely accept and instrumentalize without question. And I mean, I think that, as some of us discussed at the most recent American Studies conference in Puerto Rico, some of this, I think, is reflective of the particular stage of empire that the US is in right now. But in any case, I just think that it's no accident that all of these things are happening at the same time because they're such interconnected processes. So I do think that it is important to think about the kind of the broader common politic that undergirds all of these institutions and draw out these different types of connections as a way of making sense of the types of repression we experience in our spaces. Because I think that it's not everything, but it's kind of at least the starting point for thinking how do we push back, and how do we do something in terms of cultivating an alternative to the status quo.
Yeah, you mentioned your campus, but we are both in the CSU system. And
Yeah.
when you're talking about the Zoom example in the middle of COVID and how this just is, Zoom had the power to shut down a classroom space when we were all dependent on it. It made me think of our systems contract with OpenAI, and
Mhm.
and they're not exactly the same, but it would be interesting to have a conversation about that. But there are three questions in the chat, so I'm going to take them in order, and I'm going to start with the bottom. So I'm going to start with the question, the bottom of the first comment, and then I'll sort of go up and take it. So the question basically is, do you have thoughts on how not to lose the interventions that movements have made in the face of rising tech Zionism? And the context for that is thinking about the rise of Palestinian self-narration, especially as youth culture seems parallel to the rise of the 1960s challenges to state orthodoxy. That repression was successful, even though the cultural political importance of those movements is ongoing. And the stakes are even higher now. So I was asking you to think through, you know, strategies on how not to lose those interventions. And I wanted to add on a couple down that the turn to tech repression seems, as you say, a moment when tech platforms stop pretending to be public squares. If we're in a moment of tech governance, AI-driven genocide, and where tech CEOs are both Zionists and maximalists, what does this version of settler colonialism look like? Oh, actually, you know what? I'll save that for let's go with do you have thoughts on, and I'll combine this one with one that comes after it.
Yeah.
So let's go with, yeah.
The
Do you
the not to lose
have,
the interventions one.
not to lose the interventions? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I see it, we really need to have a long view of the Palestinian revolution. And I think that, I mean, there are a lot of um, particularities, let's say, to our current moment, especially regarding the way that tech as an industry is moving. But I think it's really important to still try to keep these developments as much as we can in conversation with, other different crucial moments of, historical significance to the ongoing Palestinian revolution, as I would see, like the ongoing struggle for liberation of land and people. And in fact, partly, I do have a chapter which is kind of intended to make the argument that even the things that I was looking at in terms of 2021, in terms of the media interventions that Palestinians make, that Palestinians have ultimately always been doing this work because media as a dominant industry as such has always been predicated on the erasure and the invisibilization of Palestinians. So in a sense, we could even think about, the kind of interventions that we saw Palestinians making through this usage of media to make it do what it wasn't supposed to do. Palestinians have always kind of had to navigate media in that way. So I even think of going from the famous interview with Ghassan Kanafani and Richard Carleton, right, where I mean Palestinians have always had to sort of cultivate this counter hegemonic approach to media and navigate it in a way because they were aware that from the get-go, these industries are hostile to them, right, and are hostile to the Palestinian revolutionary struggle, and so they've
And
always
in
had
the
to,
the
yeah,
book you mentioned that it resurfaces in 2015 and starts to
yeah.
circulate, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so in a sense that is interesting because it's kind of showing how this has always been the case. And yet at the same time, we're seeing that the particular utility that the internet can also have and sort of acting as a resource on some level, right, to preserving and recirculating and reminding us of all of these things. So, I mean, I do think one strategy is, of course, to always keep in mind, like, how does this relate to the broader historical nature of the Palestinian struggle as such? Because there are some aspects, I think, of our condition that are particular to trends and developments of particular industries, but it's also important to really be aware of, like, how has the Palestinian movement, been evolving, and how are some things perhaps not as unique as they may seem? And how can we also understand the the conditions that we're in as related to the different trends that we've seen the Palestinian revolutionary movement as such undergo, right? Like innovations, in different capacities for resistance in the broader kind of geo-imperial context. All of these things you really have to keep in mind as we're taking stock of the current moment. Because I think the worst thing that could happen is that to fall into this dynamic where we sort of exceptionalize the present so much that we don't even think about the past anymore. And I kind of think that to a certain extent, that's sort of what the powers that be want for us to do, right? Um, on the most basic
So,
level. Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
I'm just going to say I just saw Palestine 36 last night, and journalism, of course, is a major player in that, um, uh, you know, demonstration or representation of the Arab revolt in 36 in Palestine in particular.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly, exactly. So yeah, I just think we always need to kind of keep a historical focus, on our present conditions as much as we can. And of course, that's an ongoing process. It's not something that happens instantaneously. It's an impulse that, we have to keep kind of cultivating within ourselves.
Yeah. The next question is about the attention economy. They ask, how does censorship of the Palestinian liberation struggle affect the attention economy? Where and how does Palestine appear in a context where everyone is vying for attention? Are there any similarities between online and offline censorship regarding the seemingly limited attention span of American audiences?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that it's definitely very connected to the idea of the attention economy because I think that there's often an assumption that if we just take something offline enough, then it's not going to be a point of focus anymore. So I do think that, I mean, censorship as such, I think with regards to Palestine really is intended to just keep the people and keep the topic off of the platforms as much as possible. But I do think there's also this broader idea that if we just stop, platforming this as much as we can, then people will stop caring about it. Um, and I do believe that that's an intentional strategy from, all types of media institutions. I think it's to the credit of the movement that people have really become aware of that, though. And so oftentimes people will push back and say, you know what, we may not have seen as many posts about this, but this is still ongoing. So people have started to really become aware of how to navigate this intended manipulation of the attention economy to kind of make interventions that remind people that you not seeing something doesn't mean it's not happening anymore, or it doesn't mean that people aren't even talking about it. It just means that you've been stopped from seeing it or that you're not able to access it for whatever reasons. So I think that there is this attempt to do that, but I also think people are becoming savvy enough to really be able to work around it. Um, and I think, for better and for worse, some of the novelty of the internet as such has kind of worn off to where we're aware now that, like, okay, a lot of this is the result of kind of artificial curation. Maybe that comes from, algorithmic curation or censorship. And so we need to find strategies for circumventing the ways that, different sites or spaces will limit or restrict conversation around these topics. And so how do we work around that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go down to the most recent question, which asks, are there specificities to digital settler colonialism that distinguish it from digital colonialism more broadly? And I don't know if the latter, digital colonialism, makes me think of Ulysses Mejias and Nick
Mhm.
Coulter's framing. I'm not sure if that's what it's referencing, but
Yeah, well, I think yeah, I think their work is really great. And thinking about data as this, this new space of colonization. And I think I've heard them speak. I forget if it was Tech Won't Save Us or what interview it was, but basically they make it very clear that people think that digital, like the digital sphere is the new innovation, but actually it's data, like the way that data can be mined and colonized in the same way that other lands were once, ripe for seizure and for extraction. Um, I think that there's a lot of overlap between digital colonialism and digital settler colonialism, but the way that I use it, and I should say that I've also, part of my reference points were Michael Quet's work on digital colonialism, which was looking at, how South Africa, in particular, acted as this laboratory for tech companies to engage in different forms of data mining and surveillance, in the context of education, I believe. So, you have tech companies that were donating all of these resources, educational resources, but the kind of takeaway was that in fact they're actually extracting a lot of data from people in doing that, and so that that really was what they were looking for. And so, he makes this argument that tech companies, today are kind of like the Dutch East India Company of the past. Like that's where colonization really thrives is through the surveillance and mining of data ultimately. And of course, they're using, um, you know, spaces, in the third world ultimately as their laboratories for refining these tactics. But I think the distinction in terms of digital settler colonialism is it begins with a focus on how these practices are honed to best reinforce and streamline the policies that are meant to realize the ultimate goal of the settler colonial project, which in this case is, the total dispossession, expulsion, and erasure of, the Palestinians. Or I think, and you can think in other studies that also look at the same phenomenon, but in Turtle Island, right? So we're looking at strategies that are being particularly applied to dispossess indigenous peoples. But of course, there's going to be broader overlap, with other colonial processes. And increasingly, of course, with, imperial processes, because oftentimes these things happen as part and parcel of a broader imperialist politic as such, that necessitates, supporting multiple different projects of oppression, of dispossession, and of extraction, right? So there's definitely going to be a lot of overlap, I would say.
thank you. And I'll go back up to the question. It's like really beautifully framed that I had started to read earlier. But thinking about the turn to tech repression seems, as you say, a moment when tech platforms stop pretending to be public squares. And I'll just do a little tangential add-on to say that um, when Musk took over and renamed Twitter to be X, there were a series of advertisements that went on that said, now I'm not sure if I'll remember exactly, but they were basically, they were like, talking about the town hall, like the town square. But the advertisements were trying to get people to purchase like the, you know, per, I forgot what it was called, the premium version that would allow you access to the town square, basically. So it was almost like a really beautiful kind of just like concise articulation of what town square, in fact, means in this universe. But so when tech platforms stopped pretending to be public squares or alternately started selling access to the public square, inherently not making it public, if we're in a moment of tech governance, AI-driven genocide, and where tech CEOs are both Zionist and maximalists, what does this version of settler colonialism look like? Does land theft become theft of internet as territory? What does elimination and replacement look like? So it's sort of building on the last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks like pretty much what we've been seeing, where you have these seeming escalations, like the war in Iran, ethnic cleansing in Lebanon, you know, the, kidnapping, you know, of presidents, right? All of these things kind of playing out all at once and at the same time. Um, the internet as such becoming increasingly restricted in terms of the different types of pushback or commentary that that it will broker essentially. Um, and I think it's not an accident that a lot of people will kind of use the metaphor mask off to talk about some of these developments. But I think if we look at the work of people like I think it's Becca Lewis, who kind of talks about the patriarchal and kind of like right-wing misogynistic sort of heart of Silicon Valley as such as an industry, realize that a lot of these platitudes that were given to democracy or free speech always were sort of just markers of cynical branding more than they were um, you know indicators of an actual commitment to any kind of, let's not even say liberatory, like let's just say uh, a general liberal project of promoting increased inclusion. In fact, these are companies that have always hewed to the kind of military imperial status quo. And so it's not really an accident that as we enter into a political moment that is a lot more um, I guess let's say that doesn't bother as much with kind of um, surface cosmetic political performance, that they're going to sort of take the opportunity to be as restrictive as possible, because their ultimate intention has always been to follow the bottom line that hews most to the broader corporate political establishment, and that is supporting all kinds of projects of imperial violence and warfare. So I think it's going to look like, the physical violence of, expansion, of extraction, of bombardment is going to just be increasingly mashed with, even more of a kind of erasure of any and all space or semblance to speak out against it as much as possible. Which again, Palestinians have already been experiencing, for years. I just think it's going to continue to escalate and kind of escalate outward. Um, so it's definitely not good, but I think that this also stems back to the issue of the way that hegemony works, and the way that capitalism works, because I think that that's ultimately really the problem at the heart of all of this is corporations, particularly corporations under this sociopolitical configuration, have never really been saviors. In fact, they've always been very much direct and willing partners in the different forms of oppression that plague, people domestically and the world over. So in a sense, it was only a matter of time. I don't necessarily think we people thought that it would take this particular form necessarily, but it was only a matter of time before we got to a juncture, kind of like this. So I just think we'll continue to see escalations, and the censorship is going to continue to match the different forms of, political aggression and escalation that we see playing out, in the world around us.
Thank you. I wanted to take us to, you already spoke to resistance and some of you have an entire section on it in the book, which is great. But there was one that I wanted to ask about. Maybe it can be a kind of like way to round out. It almost seems, this will also help us think through how quickly things move. But in the book, you talked about that moment of talking about banning TikTok.
Mhm.
Now that seems a little, what's the word, like nostalgic or something, now that we're in like the Ellison universe of TikTok. But you described it as a moment of imperial anxiety. And so it's sort of taking solace in that. And so, yeah, I wondered if you could add more examples or had more ways that we can think about this kind of imperial anxiety and the other ways we might see it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In that instance, I was really thinking of how I mean, the attempt to ban TikTok really goes all the way back to 2020, and of course, it's it's initially really bound up with this kind of, what I call the imperial anxiety, this anxiety around kind of the rising influence, and power of China ultimately, right? So there was this political attempt to kind of use this app as a Trojan horse for, basically striking a blow against China, but in this case, kind of at the corporate level, right? By finding, loopholes to essentially ban this app that allowed them, increasing prominence kind of in the tech world, right? Because up until that point, it had really been American tech companies that were kind of setting the mold. Then all of a sudden, you get this Chinese app that kind of, really epitomizes the new directions that you're seeing in terms of video and streaming, as opposed to the primarily text-based models of the older sites that we saw. And so that, obviously, there's this imperial anxiety from the fact that, this country is kind of rising. And so there's an attempt to create a panic around China, around TikTok, right? As sort of a Trojan horse for that. And that doesn't really take off. It's not until you have the genocide and you have, the, forces like the ADL, that really start to, very much say, as people have said, the quiet part out loud, where you don't just have Greenblatt saying, we have a TikTok problem, we have a Gen Z problem, we need, all these forces, that gave us tag lead and birthright and all of this to put their minds, to TikTok. You also have politicians who are saying literally there's too much footage coming out of Gaza and it's making people critical of Israel and we need to stop that. So it's literally people are saying that people are just seeing too much of what's happening in the world and we need to make sure that we shut down this app as a result of it. So, I think it's interesting because I think just a few years ago, I would have said that, there's no way that people are going to try to just stop the ability to film or transmit film because, just the technocratic ability to disseminate footage and information like is so advanced at this point. And yeah, actually what we're seeing is exactly that attempt. Now you have the Ellisons, having TikTok as well as, CBS. And so it's this consolidation of control, this kind of cross media platform control ultimately. And from the top down, it's very clear that the directive is to make sure that the programming is infused, with Zionism, with, this kind of, reflexive support for Israel as much as possible, as an attempt of really kind of curtailing this. But I think that the TikTok example is important because it also demonstrated how, the opposition to, the movement for a free Palestine is very interconnected to different, other types of kind of imperial mandates, let's say, for total domination. In this moment, it was really this opposition to kind of the rising influence and power of China that kind of was able to couple with this real aversion and fear of a new consensus around Palestine emerging. Of course, the young people were very much stigmatized for this, but I think that we're talking about, in general, kind of a broader cultural shift, that's happening at multiple levels. So I think the TikTok example was an important one for thinking of how different types of imperialist sentiments, are often very intermixed with, anxieties around the Palestinian struggle, because ultimately, um, support for Palestine is part of a broader anti-imperial politic. And so the flip side, support for Zionism is part of a very much an imperialist politic as such. So we'll often see a lot of convergencies around, opposition, from different institutions, that will show those interests coming together, I believe.
Yeah, and I think I would just name what somebody mentioned in the chat as a key takeaway of your talk, that the function of digital repression is extremely, extremely material, deepening longstanding material violence. Um, and so if that's true, then it's true that the forms of resistance that have come out throughout this course of that you've described throughout the course of the talk are equally material, and that materiality is evidenced by the anxiety, by the efforts to shut it down, control it, and these kinds of things. So I think maybe this is one of the best ways to round out on that note. And with tremendous gratitude and lots of thanks echoed in the chat as well. Thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really a big fan of the Institute and all you do. So it was a big honor to be here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.